I love the stories in the Bible. But when you read these stories or you try to study them, you could be missing a lot of what the author wants to tell you. So here are some simple tips to level up your reading of any Bible story. Hey, I'm Ryan Kilgore. Welcome to In the Bible. I'm really glad that you're joining me today. When somebody tells a story, there are things that they do, maybe without even realizing it, that embed their intentions into the story that they tell. And the authors of the Bible were no different in that respect. There are clues in the text that will help you to know what the author was trying to convey, what their main point was, or what they wanted you to understand as the reader. And so if you can do a better job of just paying attention to those clues that are already there in the story itself, you're going to get more out of your study or of your reading of that particular story. So today I want to share with you 4 elements of what is called narrative analysis that I use whenever I'm reading or studying any story in the Bible. Okay, now before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity just to click that like button down below and also subscribe to my channel so that you'll get an alert whenever I post some new content. And I sure hope that you'll stick around until the end of this video because I'm going to share with you one really important reason why using these tips in your study of biblical stories is really going to make an important difference. Okay, here's the first element that I want to share with you about narrative analysis, and that is settings and props. So when we read a story in the Bible, the author of that particular story is going to tell us where it took place, some of the things that were used in that story, and they may give more emphasis to the setting where it takes place or less emphasis. And so as you read a story in the Bible, notice what the author tells you about the place where it happens, the things that are utilized in that story. And I find that it can be helpful to sort of think about each story that you read as though you're attending a play. And up on the stage there is a backdrop. There's some things that give you a sense of the place where this scene is happening in the play. There are also, of course, many objects in that scene. You know, there may be a table or there may be a box or whatever there happens to be in that story. And if you read the Bible story and you look at it through that lens, some of the things can pop out to you. You'll notice what the author of that story is emphasizing by how much description they give to those elements, the settings and the props. So this will make more sense when we look at an example together. So let's start by looking at an example from the book of Matthew. Okay, so the example that we're going to look at here in Matthew chapter 26, just verses 6 to 9, and it's just the first part of a story here in the book of Matthew. So let's read it together. Now when Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." So let's look here at what Matthew tells us about the setting where this story takes place. He tells us right at the beginning that Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. So it takes place in a house. It takes place in Bethany. Well, why does Matthew bother to tell us where Jesus was? Well, it's significant that Bethany was where this takes place. Jesus spent a lot of time there. He had relationships with people there. He had supporters there. It's also important just for the setting of the story to know that Jesus is in a home. So then let's also consider what props Matthew describes in this story. If you notice in verse 7, it says that a woman came up to him, that is to Jesus, with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment. She poured it on his head as he reclined at table. So table would be another prop possibly, or just part of the setting. It doesn't really matter. It's taking place at a meal, evidently, is what we ought to know. But you may notice immediately here that there's some extra detail given about this flask of ointment. Matthew doesn't just say that there was a flask or a container or bottle, but he specifically mentions that it was an alabaster flask. And he doesn't just say that it was ointment, he says that it was very expensive ointment. And so this extra detail that Matthew gives us here is a clue for us. It tells us that he wants us to know more about this ointment, more about this flask, because it's a significant part of this story. And you see the disciples' response. They're concerned with the propriety of this woman's actions, whether that was a wasteful action to waste this ointment that was so costly. It could have been put to better use. And that becomes a subject of more controversy later in the story than just what we've read here. But the fact that Matthew gives us these extra details should be a clue to us to notice that this is something important. We need to pay attention to it and what part it plays in this story. And not every story in the Bible, of course, is going to have extra detail given to its setting or to any props that take place there. But when you do notice some of those additional details, that's a clue. Pay attention because there's a reason that the writer of that story mentions the extra details. If there are no extra details given, if there's very little attention given to where the story takes place, that tells you that that's not a significant part of that story, and you shouldn't put your attention on that either. Okay, now the second element that I want to share with you that I think will help you study stories in the Bible is characters. Now, every story has characters. People typically are characters in the Bible. God is often a character in a story. Even animals sometimes can be characters as well. And the authors in the Bible will develop the characters in those stories in different ways. So you want to pay attention to the characters in the story as you read and ask yourself, well, what do I see them do in this story? What does the author tell me about these characters? Let's look at an example now and we'll see how that goes. So let's read this story from the book of Mark. It's in chapter 3, and we're going to read verses 1 to 6. So pay attention to the characters and how they're developed here in this story. It says here, "Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Come here.' And he said to them, 'Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?' But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him." So let's identify now the characters that we find in this story. The first character, of course, is Jesus. He's not actually identified by name, but it's clear from the context that this is a story about Jesus. The second character is this man who has a withered hand, whom Jesus heals. And then the third character is actually a group of people that Mark tells us were there at the synagogue looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. They're identified later as Pharisees in this story. There is a fourth character, this group of Herodians that is mentioned, but they're not developed at all in the story, so they really don't function as a character. Now, this group of people is basically one character because they're not identified as individuals or developed as individuals at all outside of this group. And so this whole group of accusers basically functions as one character in this story. Now, characters can be developed by an author in basically two ways. The first way is that the author can describe the character, tell us about them, maybe what they look like or where they come from, what kind of a person they are. The second way is that the author can tell us the things that the character does. So the actions they take, the things that they say, maybe even their thoughts or their reactions to other events that take place in the story. And by the way, one of the features of the book of Mark is that Mark tends to focus most of his attention on actions that take place. He doesn't spend a lot of time dealing with describing and giving details about the characters or the places in the story. He goes right to the action. And so let's take a look now at how he develops these characters in the story. So first of all, how does Mark describe Jesus? How does he develop that Jesus as a character? So let's look at what Mark tells us about who Jesus is or the things that Jesus does. Here we have in verse 1, it says that he entered the synagogue. So that's the first action that Jesus performs. He just comes into the synagogue where this story takes place. Then down in verse 3, he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. So he's speaking. And again in verse 4, he's speaking. He said to them. So he's speaking now to the people who want to accuse him. And then in verse 5, it says that he looked around at them with anger. And it says that he was grieved at their hardness of heart. Then it says he said to the man. So he speaks again. He tells the man to stretch his hand out. And that's all the things that we see Jesus do. Now, do you notice a pattern here in this story from Mark's characterization of Jesus? Most of the things that Jesus does in this story is that he speaks. He says to the man with the withered hand, he said to them, he said to the man. So that's most of what Jesus does. Even the healing that Jesus performs isn't described as a separate act. He just tells the man to stretch out his hand, and when the man does, the healing takes place. So most of what Mark tells us about Jesus is the things that he says. He does tell us about Jesus' emotional state, whether that's an action or a characterization by a description. It's not exactly clear. It just says that he was grieved at their hardness of heart. But nonetheless, there's a little bit of a pattern there that we can notice just by noticing how Mark characterizes Jesus. So now let's look at this second character. That's the man with the withered hand. So all he tells us basically about this man is that he has a withered hand. And then if we go down to verse 5, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And it says he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. So the only thing that Mark tells us about this man is he characterizes him as having a withered hand, and we see that the man acts to stretch out his hand when Jesus tells him to, and then the hand is restored. So he enters at one state and he leaves the story in a different state, but the only action he actually performs is stretching out his hand in this story. It's interesting that Jesus calls the man to come to him back in verse 3 there, but the man isn't actually described as doing that. We just assume that he in fact did do that. It seems clear from the context, but Mark doesn't bother to tell us about that action. Okay, now let's consider how Mark characterizes this group of accusers that he identifies as Pharisees. So let's look at what Mark says about them. Here in verse 2, it says that they watched Jesus. So that's the first thing that Mark tells us, is that they watched him to see whether he would heal the man on Sabbath so that they might accuse him. So they're looking to accuse. So he just spends a little bit of time describing their attitude toward Jesus. They're looking to accuse him. And then if we come down to verse 4, Jesus asks them this rhetorical question. And of course, they don't have an answer, and so Mark tells us that they were silent. So they just sat there. And then in verse 6, after this story is basically completed, the healing is done, the Pharisees went out. So he tells us that they were Pharisees there at the end finally. He tells us that they went out and that they held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So notice the characters that get the most attention here in Mark's telling of this story. As you look at the way that Mark tells this story and the characters here, where does that point your attention? Well, it seems to be clearly on Jesus and his accusers, much more than on the man who is healed by Jesus. Evidently, there's probably other people there at the synagogue as well, but Mark just doesn't even bother to mention that they exist. So this story is clearly about Jesus and his interaction with these accusers who are present there. Even though it's a story about the healing of this man, he's not really characterized much in the story. And so the focus of the story isn't on this man's troubles. You notice it's not about the relief that he experienced Mark doesn't mention the faith that he has, how he responded to Jesus. He evidently had enough faith to stretch out his hand when Jesus asked him to, but Mark doesn't bother to give any attention to that or mention it, even though he tells us that the man stretched out his hand. So when we stop to notice the characters here and their descriptions, it becomes clear that this story is actually about Jesus and his controversy with these hypocrites because they wanted him to challenge him about healing on Sabbath when they themselves are plotting his death on that same day. And so that's really where the focus of the story is, and we can see that clearly when we notice the way that Mark tells the story with these characters. All right, we're ready now for number 3, and that is actions. Actions are the events, the speeches, the other things that take place in the story. And there are many ways that the author can describe those actions for emphasis or for storytelling effect. So we want to pay attention to a few things here as we consider actions. How much detail does the author give? How much attention do they place on the different actions that take place? In some stories, you may notice that an author will skip over many of the actions in the story that obviously have taken place. Maybe they're just mentioned very briefly, or maybe they're not mentioned at all. But then perhaps the author will really stop and focus on one particular action, give a lot of detail to describe it. This is a clue that the author wants to place their emphasis here. It should be pretty obvious, but when you notice that, then you can make sure that you place your attention there and try to understand why did the author emphasize this action and skip out all of the others. The author can do some other things with actions for storytelling effect as well. For instance, they can describe actions out of their chronological order. They can make reference to events that take place outside of the story that they're telling, or they can make repeated reference to one event a number of times, and noticing those things in the actions that are described by the author can also be helpful. So let's take a look now at an example in the book of Numbers. So in this story from Numbers 20, verses 2 to 13, I've selected just some of the verses just for the sake of time, and I've left some out. And you can go back and look at that on your own. But I want to draw your attention to the way that this story is told with the events that take place here. So in verse 2 there in Numbers chapter 20, it says, "Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron." And in verse 7 it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and their cattle." And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. And he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." So let's just go through the story here now that we've read it through once, and let's circle the actions that we see taking place that are described in the story. First of all, it says that there was no water. So that's an action that takes place, or an event rather, we would say. Then it says they assembled. It's talking about the people of Israel. And it says that the Lord spoke to Moses. And he said, "Take the staff." So that's another event. He tells him to assemble the congregation, you and Aaron. And he tells him to tell the rock. So he wants him to speak to the rock to yield its water. And he repeats that again, "You shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle." And then it says that Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. So it makes reference to a number of events that take place there. And now just for the sake of time, I left out all the description in verses 3 to 6. You see there, just have verse 2, and then I skipped to verse 7. In verses 3 to 6, there's all the people grumble against Moses and Aaron. That would be something worth noticing if you were doing a more thorough study of this story, all of the emphasis or the space that the author of Numbers gives to their grumbling against Moses and Aaron. But I do want you to notice the detail that this story gives us about God's speech to Moses. The story devotes a decent amount of space to the specific instruction that God gives him. You notice he says, take the staff. He says, assemble the people, speak to the rock. You shall bring water. And then Moses does those things. Moses took the staff. And so already we can see how the story is setting up what is going to come next. So let's go on to the next slide. And let's notice the actions that take place in this second part of the story that we have here. So Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. He said to them, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and he struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly. The congregation drank, and their livestock. And then it goes on to describe the speech of God. God, the Lord, said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. So there's a lot of events that are just mentioned, or actions that are mentioned by the author here. There's a lot of details. So let me just point out a couple of things from this part. So notice the description of Moses when he's there at the rock. The story tells us first that he addresses the people in a confrontational way. He says, hear now, you rebels. And so he's really emphasizing the confrontation that takes place here. He's emphasizing himself as one who is providing for them, even though, of course, it's God who's providing. And then it says that he lifted up his hand and he struck the rock with his staff twice. So he lifted up his hand, he struck the rock with his staff twice. He mentions that it happened 2 times. And so the author could have just said that Moses struck the rock, because that's what he did, right? But notice the extra detail there. He makes the point of emphasizing what Moses is doing, that he's not following the instructions that he was just given, because God gave Moses the instruction and that was recorded. And then in Moses carrying out the instruction, it isn't the same. There's a significant difference. Lifted up his hand, struck the rock twice. So the author's choice of description really emphasizes this and emphasizes Moses' state of mind and, in this case, his lack of faith in God. So as you read stories in the Bible, you'll come across settings and props, you'll come across characters, actions as well. And now I want to share with you a fourth element of narrative analysis that I think is really going to help you to get more out of your study of biblical stories, and that's plot. The plot is the journey that the story takes from its problem to its resolution. Any good story has some unknown element in it, some problem that needs to be resolved or some mystery that has to be solved. It's what keeps us wanting to continue hearing the story or reading it. We want to find out what happens to the characters, or how does the mystery get solved in the end. So the plot usually begins with a problem that needs to be solved, and that's usually introduced somewhere right at the beginning to establish the tension for the story. That problem is then developed, it's expanded, we begin to understand the problem a little bit better as we understand the characters perhaps, and it moves toward a crisis or a climax where there's a point in the story where that problem either is going to be solved or it's not going to be solved, and it's sort of the peak of the story. After that takes place, there may be some further development in what's called a complication. That's present in some stories and it's absent in others. And then finally we move to the conclusion of the story, the resolution, where everything is resolved and the story comes to an end. So to understand better how this applies to biblical stories, let's look again at that same story from Numbers chapter 20. Okay, so what is the problem in this story, or what is it that needs to be solved? Well, immediately at the very beginning of the story, it says there was no water. So there's your problem that comes up right at the beginning. It's just stated as the problem that introduces the whole story. Then the people assemble themselves against Moses and against Aaron. They assemble themselves against Moses and against Aaron. Again, for the sake of time, I've left out all of their complaints against Moses and Aaron in verses 3 to 6. But you should notice that this problem is developed further here to the point that it almost becomes a separate problem or a separate issue. It's not just the lack of water. The lack of water has caused a rift. There's an uprising that's taken place against Moses and Aaron. So we see that it's not just a physical problem, but it's a relational problem, it's a national problem, and in reality it's actually even a spiritual problem as well. But we started with no water, and then very quickly the problem grew in this story. It's a problem of the people going against Moses and Aaron. And so in the story then, Moses is looking for a solution. He goes into God's presence, and God tells him what to do. So it should feel like we're progressing toward the resolution, right? Well, we're going to come to the climax next. So what does Moses do then after God has given him this instruction? Well, instead of speaking to the rock like he was told, it says here that he lifted up his hand, that he struck the rock with his staff twice. And so where we should have come to the climax and then the solution, the resolution of the story, there was actually a little bit of a reversal in this story. The problem should have been resolved. God had given Moses the answer, told him what to do, that water was going to come out. People would have been satisfied, at least in the short term. But Moses didn't do that, and so the problem has developed. It's morphed from the problem of Moses providing water to the people and them having enough to drink, and now the problem is between God and Moses, because of Moses' lack of faith and his basically wanting to put himself in the place of a provider or kind of go ahead of God in a sense. And so that becomes the complication in the plot of this story. So then God tells Moses at the end of this passage here, "Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." And so we see the consequence that Moses and Aaron suffer as a result of that. And that then provides the resolution, the conclusion to this story. But one of the things about the Bible is that the whole Bible is really one big story. It begins, of course, in the book of Genesis, where we see the problem right at the beginning. After God creates this beautiful world, suddenly it's spoiled by sin. And then the problem, of course, is developed as the story of the Bible continues. God interacts with people working to save them, and we see the results of sin and how bad things get until we finally come to the crisis or the climax of the story where God sends his own son to die on a cross in order to redeem these people who have been lost because of sin. The story faces some additional complication later in the New Testament, of course, before finally we get a glimpse of the conclusion of that whole story that's described in the book of Revelation, where God puts an end to sin and he recreates that beautiful, problem-free world that he had originally created. And each of the books in the Bible is just one part of that larger story. And of course, each book in the Bible may be made up of many smaller stories that make up the larger story of the book, which of course is part of the larger story of the whole Bible. So when you read any particular story, it's going to be connected to other stories that it's a part of. For example, what we just read in Numbers chapter 20, that story doesn't stand on its own. It's connected to the other stories in the Bible. Immediately, it reminds us of the story from Exodus, the book of Exodus, where God tells Moses to strike the rock that is there in the wilderness, and water then comes out and it provides water to drink for the people of Israel who've just come out of slavery. And so then the story here in the book of Numbers plays on that story because God tells Moses this time to speak to the rock, and instead Moses strikes it. And it's also part of the story of the Israelites and their journey and their relationship with God. They're always grumbling, they're always complaining. They lack faith in Him whenever they come into any kind of trial at all. And we see that again in this story. This story is also part of a larger story about Moses. He always seems to rush ahead of God. He never wants to be patient and wait for God to work. He always wants to do it his own way. And so we see here in this particular story that the process of growth isn't yet complete in Moses' life. So when you read any story in the Bible and you follow its plot, remember that it's part of a larger story and a larger plot as well. Okay, now, like I promised in the beginning, let me give you one really important reason why I believe you are going to be blessed by paying better attention to the stories that God has given us in the Bible. But first, if you're new here, please introduce yourself down in the comments. I'd really like to know what your favorite story in the Bible is. And if you have any questions about what I've shared here today, or if you have any other comments, just leave those in the comments as well. So these analytical tools, paying attention especially to the setting and the props that are used in the story, to the characters, the actions that take place, and the plot that the story follows. Doing these things are going to help us to focus our attention on what the author intended us to get out of the story. You see, they had some big thing in mind as they were telling this story, some point that they wanted us to get. And when we put our focus on what they had in mind as the big thing in that story, we're going to be less likely to go astray in our interpretation and get off track and misinterpret Scripture. And so by focusing on what the Bible writer had in mind for us as they were inspired by God to share this story with us, that's going to be a safeguard for us as we seek to grow and to understand God's Word and to apply it to our lives. That's not to say that there isn't other truth in those stories other than just whatever the main point of the story is in that case. But we're not going to be focused on it, and we're not going to obsess about things that aren't the main point of the story. Well, I sure hope that you got value out of this video today. If I helped you to grow in your appreciation for the Bible and for the stories that it contains, would you do me a favor and just give back a little bit? I want this channel to grow and to be successful, and you can help with that by sharing this video with somebody else that you think might enjoy it. You can also click that like button down below, and while you're down there, you might as well subscribe to my channel as well if you're not already subscribed. All of those things are going to help YouTube's algorithm to know that they ought to suggest this video to somebody else as well. I sure hope you've been blessed today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.